Welcome to the Mary Washington House Garden. The garden as you see it today was actually designed in 1969 and installed with the help of the Garden Club of Virginia. Right behind me we're standing by one of the iconic pieces in our garden. It's a Crepe Myrtle. It looks very old, but it was planted in 1969 and it's about 55 years old. It enjoys being in the shade at the base and its head up in the sun, so it's in its perfect location. We're going to walk along the path now and we'll head down to the path that Mary walked. We affectionately call it Mary's Walk. And this is the path that she took nearly daily to visit her daughter at Kenmore and also Meditation Rock, which is just about 3 blocks down. Here in the garden, as we're walking along the path, we have these old boxwood. They are the oldest plants in the garden, and for a long time it was thought that these boxwood were planted by Mary Washington. But we had some scientific testing done, and they're dated to about 1820, but it makes them about 200 years old, but about 50 years too late to be Mary's plantings. Unfortunately, we don't have any documentation of how Mary's garden looked at the time that she lived here. Everything that we have is anecdotal, and it just says that she planted boxwood along this path, had a lawn that she entertained on, and liked roses and tulips. So not very much to go on. When the garden was redesigned, it was created in an American colonial revival style, which means that everything was planted symmetrically with rectangles and squares, and it would always include a working vegetable garden in order to feed the household. So as you see here, we now have some plants in the garden, including leeks, lettuce, potatoes, and a lot of things that we generally grow now. As we continue on through the garden, you'll see that we have a couple of really large trees at the back. And again, it looks like they've been here for hundreds of years, but these are hackberry trees. They were planted in 1969, so again, about 55 years old. The hackberry is considered one of the most flexible woods in the world, and it's a native here. The back of the garden is planted with, not exclusively, but lots of native plants. And the hackberry trees were used in colonial times and harvested for fishing rods. So as we walk through, you'll see lots of different plantings. Some of our perennials look familiar, and that's because a lot of perennials have been in cultivation for centuries now. All the plants that were chosen to be put into the design in 1969 are all plants known to commonly have grown in Virginia at the time that Mary lived here. So it does represent pretty closely something what Mary could have had. As we walk on through, you're going to see one of my favorite flowers in the garden, and this one is known as campanula. In colonial times, they referred to it as chimney flower, and that's because it begins to bloom at the time that you no longer used a fireplace. So they would come out and cut the flowers and fill the hearth with it to decorate it when it wasn't in use. Here we have an arbor, and it's to kind of honor the path that Mary would have walked and continued on to Kenmore. And again, this was a gift from the Garden Club of Virginia. Here we have the native oak leaf hydrangea, and it's in full bloom now, so you can see how beautiful it is. It is quite a large shrub. It is planted at the back of our garden here, and it's just nice, sweetly scented. This tree over here is called black haw. It's Vipernum Prunifolium for those of you who like to use botanical names. This is a native viburnum, and it's one of the plants that early colonists learned about from the Native Americans. The Native Americans use the fruit that comes on it to make a jelly and also as a treatment for cramps. We now know that it works as an actual muscle relaxer, so we know it's efficacious. As we continue on, you'll notice that we have brick paths that we're walking on, but the brick itself wasn't existent here. Brick was actually kind of an expensive material to use for a path. More than likely, Mary would have just thrown old oyster shells down on the ground to make the mud a little easier to traverse. And here we're underneath our redbud tree, another native. And although many people aren't aware of it, but the yuccas as well, which is just coming into bloom now, are also a native plant here. So again, although our back row isn't exclusively native, there was a definite nod to native plants as we came in. So we're going to continue down now. We've got one of our larger perennial borders in the garden. And it's a mixture of plants that are native and non-native. Again, you'll see our beautiful campanula blooming. The daylilies are one of the Asian imports, and in the later 18th century, that's when a lot of the plants were being brought from Asia to the New World, and daylilies are included in that. So in the 1890s, when the ladies were first tending to the garden when the museum opened, they planted some really small 6-inch tall boxwood. Those boxwood were actually replanted in the 1969 design, and those are these large boxwood that you now see, which are about 125, 130 years old. So we've been trying to take care of them as best we can. As we come around the corner, you'll start to see our companion Crepe Myrtle. It's not quite as happy as the large one that we saw at the beginning of the tour, but it is its companion, and I do my best to care for it. And as we come around the corner, we're going to come to what I think is the favorite part of my garden, and that's the lawn area and also the sundial and the sundial pedestal. This is the only piece in the entire garden that we know that Mary touched. The sundial was brought with her from Ferry Farm when she moved here to her last home. And when you see the sundial, the top of it itself, this sundial, has been replaced numerous times. There's a rumor that in the Civil War some soldier stole it. This is a more modern piece, but you can see our beautiful Aquia stone from the Aquia quarry up in Stafford County, and this dates to at least 250 years old. So I like to touch something that maybe Mary's touched. And out here in the garden, you'll see a classic example of an 18th century garden with a rectangular lawn surrounded by symmetrical plantings on either side. I hope you enjoyed your visit here to the Mary Washington House Garden, and maybe we'll see you in the garden sometime.